I just gotten a phone call for an interview on Gilmore Girls up on the Warner Brothers lot. I was walking out the door and I get another phone call, um, and it's Norman. He's working on a show called Fastlane and wanted to interview me. I guess he had just found my name on the union availability list, which is like, I always just kind of figure you put your name on that list. It's sort of a formality, but you don't really expect a lot to come of it. So anyway, and it's at Warner Brothers. So I have two interviews at Warner Brothers, and we just really hit it off. He said that he had been talking to a couple of people, but yeah, just it was great to meet him. And then I ended up assisting him on Fastlane that year, and he took me over to the pilot for the OC, and ended up working on that with him. Though I worked on that all 4 years, and then gradually slots just started opening up because there were only two editors on that show. And so they would obviously get pretty backed up. But it was great. It was like going to editing school every day and getting paid for it. And just, the amount of knowledge that I got working with him, and also with Matt Ramsey, the other editor on that show, is just phenomenal. And I really credit, most of my success in my career to both of them, particularly Norman.
So is there something that he taught you that you still use every day, or something that's sort of stuck with you that not many other editors might have heard of?
Well, I don't know that not many editors might have heard of it, but I mean, just in general, the old adage of focusing on emotion the whole time, just digging out every little moment that you can. That's you're trying to play, you're trying to feel something. You want to you want to feel. When you say emotion, you think, well, okay, it's something heartfelt and sappy, but it really just means whatever you're supposed to be feeling, whether it's a laugh or whether it is something heartfelt, whether it's just kick-ass action, and it's just a matter of digging in as much as you can for every moment and trying to feel it. I always kind of try to approach what I'm cutting as a fan first of what I'm doing, and really bring my own sort of emotions to the project and everything as I'm going along. And it's a little tricky because the fan in you want everything to work out right in the scene, but then the filmmaker in you gotta kind of do the opposite. You got to throw the roadblocks in, and do the things that are gonna make the audience squeam a little bit, or feel something, or cry or laugh. So it's it's always a balancing act.
Now, I've seen with a lot of editors, when they get into their when they're finishing up an episode or a show, they usually have some kind of celebration. And I was thinking about that when I was looking at your resume. Did you ever have a sort of a celebration, or a way of wrapping up the end with your assistants?
Well, I mean, there's always the parties and whatnot.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking, like, I knew one editor who they would have a drink together. Like, they would get a nice bottle of brandy or something, and sit and have a drink to celebrate the locked picture.
I don't know. I always tend to be a little melancholy at the end of a project, because I've been fortunate that pretty much everything I've worked on has been really creatively fulfilling and fun to work on. I mean, I've really enjoyed everything I've worked on. And it's so at the end of a project, it's like you put your all into that last episode, and ideally, with your assistants, you take them with you to the next thing, if they're available. But a lot of times, your schedules, you just never know what's going to happen after that last show. So sometimes I've been able to take my assistants to the next thing, and sometimes not.
Well, I was going to say, working on things like Chuck and the OC, the Runaways, which you just started working on, is very different in terms of, it's a Marvel project, which has more, I guess, special effects and what have you. So what were some of the challenges that you learned in that transition from Chuck to things like the 100 and the Runaways?
Well, I think Chuck was pretty good training ground for all of that. I mean, we did have a fair amount of special effects on Chuck. Um, and we were kind of spoiled on that. We actually had our two sort of go-to VFX guys working in-house with us. So we could just go over to their office and say, hey, can you temp up something, just real quick for this, that, and the other thing, before it goes to the whole final VFX pass. And a lot of times they'd be able to do that for us. But yeah, that's sort of, the OC didn't have much in the way of VFX, so Chuck was really sort of my training ground for that. And then Runaways, a lot of the VFX on Runaways were, that's kind of the bigger stuff that was done after the fact. I mean, we did have a specific visual effects assistant on that show, which was great, because usually, unfortunately, when you have to, a lot of the producers really want to see temp visual effects, and that's not really my strength. I tend to kind of pawn that off on my assistants. But even the assistants, it's tough because they have so many other things to do as well. So it was nice on Runaways that we had a dedicated visual effects editor, to be able to rely on her to kind of come up with some stuff, even for temporary purposes. And then on the 100, our assistants were just amazing. It was a lot of work for them, trying to come up with a lot of these temp things. But a lot of times, they would do these amazing sort of temp visual effects that would be a really strong template for how they would actually look in the end.
Well, what's interesting is that I almost feel like you're wherever your learning ground, I guess, like the OC and Chuck and everything, very much is character driven and all about the acting and what have you. And I see that transition to like the 100 and Runaways. Like I remember watching the 100, and it's all about the characters in that.
Yeah.
It was also about the mystery. It's been a while since I've watched the 100, but it was also about like what's happening here, what's going on. So how do you tease out the mystery or work with the writers and the directors to tease out the mystery and make sure that the audience is, I guess, wound up tightly and nervous about what's happening?
I mean, I think it's just a matter of what you show and what you don't show. The 100 was obviously a very complicated plot. So, and we did a lot of sort of writing in the editing room, and there's a lot of ADR, which is where you either replace dialogue or add new dialogue. And in our case, there's a lot of writing new dialogue in the editing room that you'd put on characters' backs and stuff when their mouths aren't on screen, in order to try and really flesh out these plot points. And there was just a lot of trying to make sure as much as possible made sense. And there'd even be times where I'd be assembling my editor's cut, just thinking, what is this? I don't get this. And so I would just add my own little lines here and there, thinking, eventually the producer's going to come in and either say, oh yeah, we can do something with that. And then he'd write it better, or just say, nah, I think it did make sense actually. And I just, okay, well, if it makes sense to you, great. But yeah, in terms of the mystery of it all, it comes back to emotion. It comes back to how you want the characters to feel in any given moment, and what you're going to show, what you're going to leave out. Yeah.
Was there what was some of the restructuring or the reworking you had to do in the show?
I remember one time we were it was a studio cut day. We were like hours away from sending a cut to the studio. And there was this torture scene, this waterboarding scene. going on, and the basic purpose of this was to show it wasn't our main characters that were being tortured. It was sort of ancillary characters, and the main purpose of the scene, and it was a really long scene, was to show that they were delayed from helping out our main characters get out of the quandary that they were in. So it was like 2 hours before we were supposed to send this thing to the studio, and I was just kind of like, Jason, I gotta be honest, man, I don't really care about these people being tortured all that much, because I really only care about it in as much as it's affecting our main characters, who are in this, they were like, get stuck in a box, in a crate. And so I was just like, maybe we do an intercut here to kind of show that what's happening here is that, this torture scene, the whole purpose of it is to show that it's affecting our guys that can't get out. And he's like, I like a good intercut. And so I'm just, and I'm sitting there thinking, well, 2 hours till we go to the studio, it's like, thanks for opening your big mouth, Jeff. So I was able to throw something together in the next hour or so, and it worked. It was just like, all right, this is a good springboard. And then we continued to kind of refine it, and there's a lot of kind of stuff like that where you're jiggering scenes around to make sure that they're making more sense than they may have in their previous scripted spot.
So the premise of the show, for those who aren't aware, it's about they take 100 kids from a spaceship and put them on the planet,
Mm-hmm.
and they have to sort of survive and figure out what's going on. Did you guys, what kind of discussions were in the edit suite? Like, did you guys talk about Lord of the Flies? Like, what needs to happen to the kids?
Not really. Lord of the Flies was, I think that's something that it's a parallel that a lot of people would make in the first couple of episodes, but I think it very quickly drifts away from any comparisons to that. It's just because it's so big in scope. It's very rooted in what do you do to survive, and what do you do to keep your own people alive, and how moral are you being in trying to prioritize your own crew's lives over another crew's lives who may be or maybe not just as innocent as you guys are, and is your crew really all that innocent? So there's just a lot of explorations of those kind of themes. But yeah, what really drew me to it was just the scope of the whole thing. I had just come off of working on Hart of Dixie, which was great. I mean, I loved working on Hart of Dixie, but the one thing that was just really kind of tricky about that was the entire show was shot on the Warner Brothers lot, except for the pilot. And I was just kind of like really excited to be working on this show that had these huge location scenes, and there's mountains and forests, and you get to be out in nature and seeing all this stuff. So it was just a blast. It just felt like, the kind of stuff that I tend to gravitate towards is big picture, action, adventure, fantasy, sci-fi type stuff. So yeah, I just love the scope of it all, and then on a micro level, digging into the characters and the actors. One of the things that kept me coming back year after year was Eliza Taylor and Bob Morley's performances. They were just amazing to edit the whole time through. I mean, they just know how to grab your heartstrings the whole time. It was so fun working on their performances.
Now, you said you were sort of attracted to this project. How much did you know about it before?
I had seen the pilot, but when it came out originally, but I had just had my daughter at that time, and I was pretty swamped, and TV was not really happening, TV watching for me so much. So I just remember thinking, man, I really wish I could have continued watching this show. And they called me, and it turned out that it was with Jason Rothenberg, the producer of it. I had actually worked with him briefly on a pilot that he did a couple of years before. I just came in for a couple of days to just kind of help out when they were getting a little behind. So I was like, yeah, I remember you. I remember, and yeah, it was. I came in on the third season. Yeah, it was daunting. I mean, I remember I would sort of sit at the Avid and go through some of the other editors' timelines and whatnot. And I was just like, I mean, these things were so fleshed out. They had like 1 million audio tracks and video tracks. And I'm used to working with like 12 audio tracks and 3 video tracks. And if I get, I really try not to do more than that until it like gets toward later in the process. And I'm just looking at this. I'm like, what did I get myself into? I don't know how I'm going to be able to do this stuff. But I definitely relied on the other 2 editors, in particular, one of them, Scott Kelly, who is just amazing at getting me up to speed on it and everything. So it worked out. And they kept me around for 5 seasons. So
I feel like you decided to go from there to the Runaways, which I feel like the tracks would have been even crazier given like Marvel's.
Not so much. I mean, Runaways was really, because a lot of at least in the pilot, I know as the series went on, the visual effects just got bigger and bigger and bigger. The pilot, though, I think was a little bit more, it was just very focused on character. There were definitely visual effects, but I don't know. I didn't feel like I was really focused all that much on visual effects on that show. I mean, there were big party scees. There's this one big sort of montagey party sequence, sort of in the middle of the show, and I was working with the director Brett Morgan, and I had assembled it, just kind of how it was scripted and everything. And Brett was a guy that had he edited a lot. He's a documentary guy, and he knows how to edit. He's got the Avids and everything at his house. And so he took a swing at sort of restructuring this thing and putting it under this whole party sequence and putting it under this one music track that I had been playing with. And it was a music track that wasn't a party track at all. It was a very somber, kind of chill, emotional track. And I'm sitting there behind him as he's kind of going through doing this. I'm like, yeah, man, I'm digging what you're laying down. This is cool. And then so he's like, all right, you take it from here. And then so we switch places, and I'm like, all right, so I'm just going to kind of do my thing and do my tweaks and stuff. And then it gradually evolved from there. But yeah, it was a cool experience. And just kind of seeing how these elements would come together, and obviously, being a part of it. And but yeah, I really felt like that pilot was very character focused. And that's what I tried to focus on anyway.
Well, and pilots tend to be really hard to cut because you're setting the groundwork for the rest of the series.
Yeah, for sure.
And so there tends to be a lot of reworking. So what were some of the challenges that you guys faced when cutting the Runaways?
Trying to think back, that was a couple of years ago. I don't know. I feel like that thing came together fairly smoothly. Yeah, I mean, there may have been little plot things and character things here and there. But it's always a process. On pilots, it's always a process of discovery. And yeah, that one, I don't know, that I felt really good about that the whole time. It was a great script. And there was with Josh Schwartz and Stephanie Savage, their shows tend to be very musically heavy. So we played around with songs a lot, which is, that's sort of my favorite part of this whole job is playing with songs. And there was a lot of discovery in that whole process. We had a couple of songs in, Brett and I, when we were doing a director's cut, and then Josh came in, and Josh and Stephanie have their own flavors and stuff that they like to try. And so some of our stuff stayed in, and then some of their stuff would go in. And, Josh has a great sense of humor to it too. So whatever he brings is going to have like that sort of signature flair of his. It's just going to bring up the comedy and the heart of it all.
Now, you in the 100, you mentioned, like when you were cutting the 100, you said that you opened up the other editors' timelines and were sort of shocked at how many audio tracks there were. So how do you like to work with audio as an editor?
I am very basic. Like I said, I usually work with about 8 tracks of audio for dialogue and sound effects, and then about 4 tracks for music. And it varies, but that's sort of like the standard that I like to start with. I always find that the simpler it is, the easier it is to edit. So I try not to overcomplicate the sound mixes, the temp sound mixes that I use. And I definitely involve my assistants in that, in helping to build that out. I usually do most of the temp score myself. That's music is something that I've just it's really one of the biggest things that draws me to editing, is the way that music can bring things out. And but yeah, and just in terms of like the nitty gritty of it all, I'm pretty old school with, when it comes to like even sound mixing levels and whatnot. I very rarely use like the rubber banding on the tracks. I just do the really old school, like if I want to change the volume here, I'll put an add edit and a dissolve, and I'll change the volume on one clip. Just because, that's kind of how we did it when I first started out, when I was in college and I first started working with Norman and everything. And that's just always been faster for me. But yeah, I try to take a pretty simplistic approach to it. And then, if it calls for being fleshed out more and more, and then it does.
It's funny that you would say that about the Avid and putting the cut in to do your lowering of the audio, because before they had the rubber bands, that was how I was taught too. It's just put in a cut and fade it if you wanted to go lower slowly. So they've come a long way.
Yeah.
I have one last question for you that I like to ask everyone I interview. We've been doing these to sort of help out with the quarantine and get people to have something to watch. During the pandemic, is there a show that you caught that you were like, this is a great show and everyone needs to hear about it?
Well, we were just talking a little bit before we started about this show I've just been watching called Daybreak, that I just think is phenomenal from an editing perspective and from story perspective. It's so much fun, and there's so many layers to it. It's just one of those shows you're just like, man, I'd love to have worked on this. I don't think it's going anymore, but I do know a couple of the editors on the show that I got to reach out to them just say, hey. Yeah, it's just super clever the way they use music, the way they use songs. I'm also really into the Umbrella Academy. I think the way that they use music is incredible. There's this one episode in particular of that show where these 2 bad guys are like these guys from Sweden, and they're very like these kind of stereotypical Swedish characters. And they ended up, there was one scene where they were getting like this big comeuppance, and they started playing a Swedish version of Hello by Adele, which just was like, it was hilarious and sad and brilliant all at the same time, the way that they put this together. And I know one of the editors that worked on the first season of it, and I emailed him. I'm like, who cut this episode? It's amazing. And he's like, yeah, that was my old assistant that they bumped up. I'm like, you tell her that she's awesome. That was so much fun.
Now, you probably hear some noise. I live across from a hospital, and they're landing a helicopter at the moment.
Okay.
But thank you so much for letting me interview.
Oh, thank you. It's a blast. Appreciate it.
Have a good week.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks.